Hello, I am Paul Miles with the International Society for Biblical Hermeneutics, and this is a webinar on creationism. I'll be doing my talk today on framing the pagan myths. We have a serious problem today with, it's a hermeneutical problem. People are approaching the Bible as if it is a mythological text. That is to say that there are some who interpret Genesis as if the author of Genesis was simply turning to the pagans and their creation myths that were around him and revising it to be monotheistic. I think that this is an incorrect interpretation of Genesis, and I think that if we look at the data, consider more information than some of the mythological hermeneuticists would have us consider, then we can reframe the way that pagan myths are communicating. So here's an overview of what we'll be discussing. First, we'll look at the accusation that some people are making against the Bible. Then we will take a look at the 6 days of creation as they are developed in the Bible. We will take a look at the Egyptian myths and some evidence of what the Egyptians thought about creation. A lot of people are trying to take Egyptian myths as well as Mesopotamian and Assyrian myths and try to say, see the similarities that we have with the Genesis account. The Genesis account must have copied from them. So after we look at the Egyptian myths, we're going to look at a Mayan myth from Central America. I think we will see that there are even similarities with the Mayan myth along with the Bible, which will show that perhaps we can't necessarily assume that the Bible is the one that's copying them, being as how the Mayan myth came in an environment that was far removed from the biblical authors. So then I'll propose a biblical framing to explain why it is that we have this phenomenon in the Mayan and Egyptian myths, as well as many other myths among the pagan texts. And then we're going to take a quick look at some thoughts from atheistic evolution to see, wait a minute, it could be that it is the atheists who are borrowing from pagan mythological ideas. Okay, so let's jump in. First of all, let's take a look at the accusation. Here's a snippet from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. You can read it online. It's in Russian, but I've translated the entry for Genesis. It says, Genesis, the first book of the Pentateuch, expounds the mythological notions of the ancient Jews regarding the creation of the universe, the world, and mankind. In many aspects, it is close to the nations of the ancient Near East, as well as the legendary ancient history of the Jews. Notice that they're accusing the Jews of copying from the ancients in the Near East to form a Jewish myth. Okay, well, we expect this from the Soviet Union, the great enemies of freedom. Unfortunately, we also have such ideas coming from the mouths of British atheists as well. Richard Dawkins has said the stories of Adam and Eve and of Noah and his ark are not history. And no educated theologian thinks they are, which is false. Several educated theologians think that they are. Like countless such stories from all over the world, they are myths. There's nothing wrong with myths. Some are beautiful and most are interesting, but they aren't history. We would expect that from an atheist thinker. What about theologians, though? Here we have Peter Enns, a liberal theologian, who says Genesis 1 through 11 is clearly not prepared to provide account of history. The Israelites wrote as an ancient people, and their argument for why Yahweh is above all the other gods only worked because of the shared mythic categories between Israel and her neighbors. Notice the connection where he tries to connect Israel's thought to the pagan neighbors. Okay, well, we expect this from liberal theologians. Liberal theologians are on this great project to discredit the Bible. What is deeply concerning, though, is that we're starting to see it even within evangelicalism. So here's Tim Mackey and John Collins. They're evangelicals with the Bible Project, and they have one podcast in which they say the biblical authors didn't know certain things that we take for granted. Their cosmic geography was flat Earth. It's just the biblical conception of the physical construction of the world. Notice what's happening here. They're accusing the biblical authors of holding to a flat Earth cosmology. And if you dig further into their reasoning, it often goes right back to the pagan myths. They say we need to read the Bible as it aligns with pagan mythology. I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think that's the right way to read Genesis. We should take Genesis for what it says. Um, so, what exactly does Genesis say? Well, we see the 6 days of creation. On the first day, God created light. I think that we can also derive that he created on that day matter, as well as the separation between day and night. On day two, he put an expanse in the waters. I interpret that as saying that there was all this matter in a deep blob in the cosmos that he then expanded and sent matter far away with this expansion motion. Then on day three, here on earth, God separated the land from the waters, let land come forth, and brought forth vegetation on the land. Then on day four, he formed the distant matter into celestial bodies. On day five, he populated the sea with sea creatures, and he created birds as well. Then on day six, we have the land animals, most significantly man and woman. And then day seven is the first Sabbath. So that's the order of creation in the Bible. And I think that if we look at the pagan myths, we will often see similarities in the order of creation that our liberal friends are using to try to warp the Bible. However, I think we can easily form a new model for approaching the pagan texts. So let's take a look at some Egyptian myths. I choose Egyptian because they always have the best pictures. Other texts are always written in cuneiform, which are fun to look at, but if you don't really read cuneiform, then it's not as fun to look at. So there's that. I think as we look at these Egyptian myths, we're going to notice that there are indeed similarities between the Egyptian myths and the biblical account. But there are also differences, several differences, very significant differences at that. And I don't think that the Egyptian myths will necessarily discredit the Bible if we take them with all of the data in consideration. Okay, so let's jump into these Egyptian myths. So here is pyramid text, or I'm sorry, coffin text 714. It discusses the Egyptian primordial waters. The translation comes from James Allen's Genesis in Egypt. Okay, so it says, I, the speaker is Nun, the primeval water gods. He says, I am the waters, unique without second. That is where I developed on the great occasion of my floating that happened to me. I am the one who had developed circlet, who is in his egg. I am the one who began therein in the waters. See, the flood is subtracted from me. See, I am the remainder. It was through my effectiveness that I brought about my body. I am the one who made me. I was wished according to my heart that I built myself. Now that's a text. We can look at pictures of Nun. Here is the name written in hieroglyphs. The first little bit here is Nu. That little pot is Nu. They put it 3 times. So let us know that his name is pronounced either Nu or Noon, different translations. Then we have the sky determinative, followed by the water determinative, followed by the God determinative. Perhaps because he is the God who separates the sky from the waters. Here's a picture of him. Notice the watery skin and how he lifts up the sky boat with the sun in it. So Noon is the watery abyss, and he raises the solar boat. That seems to be reminiscent of day 2 of creation. Remember, on day 1 we see the Spirit of God hovering over the face of the deep, and then on day 2 we have the expansion. So we have this idea of a primordial water. We have an idea of expansion, from whence we get the sky. And in their case, they have 8 gods that come out of that. In the Greenfield Papyrus, we see a very clear depiction of their cosmic geography, as they would call it. We see the separation of the sky and land. This is the goddess Nut, the sky goddess above. She is held by the air god Shu, and being assisted by 2 ram-headed Hech deities. Now, Hech is supposedly a deity that is related to the eternality and the distant waters of the past. And we see the earth god Geb below them. So again, we see kind of this idea of a separation of the sky from below. There's also a deification of the sky here into a rational being. It's commonly developed throughout pagan mythology that the sky is not a great expanse, as described in the Bible with the word rakia, but rather a firm dome. We have another talk in the ISBH archives in our first webinar on cosmology. If you're interested in seeing more on the discussion on rakia, the expanse, I did a talk there. You can see it on the ISBH website, www.biblicalhermeneutics.org. But we won't get into that today. In short, the biblical account says that the sky is an expanse, that the outer space is an expanse, not a firm dome, certainly not a goddess like this. Here's another interesting bit that we see from the Roman Mamisi, which is a birth house in Dodora. Now, this is a much older text, much older picture, but it's got the god Chnum accompanied by Heket molding Ihi on a potter's wheel. It was also thought that Chnum was one who made children's bodies out of clay, so we see the formation of humans out of clay, which is similar to the biblical record, which says that Adam was made out of dirt. Here are some more texts, which I think go very different from the biblical direction. Pyramid text 600 says, Atum beetle, you became high as the hill, you sneezed Shu and spat Tefnut. Remember Shu, the air god. You put your arms around them as Ka arms so that your Ka might be in them. Ka is one of the Egyptian concepts for the soul. So we see a creation through sneezing and spitting. That's where the sky came from, or the air. Now, in some texts, you'll see that this was actually an act of masturbation by which Atum created Shu and Tefnut. This is a little bit older. There seems to be a play on words with sneeze and Shu going together. At any rate, we see a deification of the elements because they are coming from a previous god, as opposed to the biblical notion of creator-creation distinction, which God creates a creation that is entirely distinct from himself. Here is the coffin of Eteneb, and on here we can see a recurring theme throughout Egyptian literature, that we have 10 different panels, which associate 10 different body parts with 10 different deities, therefore trying to deify the various members of the body in order to deify not just creation around man, but man himself. Ultimately, this leads to what we in the Christian world would call a works-based gospel. The final call here was a heart-weighing ceremony in which the deceased person would have his heart weighed to see if he had committed sins that would prohibit him from continuing on in the afterlife. Okay, so those are Egyptian ideas about cosmology, soteriology, and eschatology. And if all that you had was the Bible and the Egyptian myths, you would see similarities and disagreements. And I can see why someone might, especially if he doesn't believe in the Bible as authoritative, I can see why he might say that the Bible may have copied from the Egyptian text, right? There are indeed similarities. However, I think if we look at the Popol Vuh, we will see some similarities as well. The Popol Vuh is a Mayan myth, which came from the Quiche people. It was preserved in oral tradition, and it was first written down in 1550. Here on the slide, we have a picture in the frame there of the oldest surviving Popol Vuh manuscript that we have. It was written in 1701 AD. This is very far removed from the biblical context of the ancient Near East. So there is no way that the Bible could have copied from these guys. What are we going to see when we look at their myth? Okay, so Popol Vuh describes the state before creation, saying, these then are the first words, the first speech. Interesting, isn't it, that creation is being done through speech, kind of like in the biblical account. It says, there is only the expanse of the water. Only the tranquil sea lies alone. So we see the same primordial water motif that is in the Bible as well as the Egyptian text. We see an order of creation. Then came his word, again, creation through speech. Heart of sky arrived here with the sovereign, and Quetzal serpent. Interesting that there's a serpent in the creation myth of the Mayans. Then they gave birth to humanity. So humanity comes after the sky. Okay, what else are we seeing? Creation through speech and separation. In order to create the earth, they said earth, and immediately it was created. Just like a cloud, like a mist, was the creation, the formation of it. Then they called forth the mountains from the waters. So we see dry land coming up from the water. Also a motif in the biblical account. Yet the Bible could not have copied this one. Then we get into a deluge. We see a fall of the mudmen and the flood. Let us make a provider, a sustainer for us. Being as how the gods were insufficient to be self-sustained, they need men. And so they go on to make men out of mud and then men out of wood. Interesting that they go to mud to make men, kind of like the Bible says, out of the dust. But the men were incapable of understanding. They did not speak before their framer and their shaper, their makers and their creators. So a flood was planned, and they were killed in the flood. So we see a flood myth to wipe out mankind after they offended gods. Also interesting that we see in the Popol Vuh a citadel and the origin of the nations coming out of the citadel, which is reminiscent, of course, of Genesis 10 and 11, the origin of the nations being actually, historically, the Tower of Babel. Okay, so that's interesting. Well, we know that the Bible did not copy from the Popol Vuh. However, we do see similarities with the Popol Vuh. I think that should cast doubt on this notion that just because there's a similarity that the Bible must have been the one copying, right? So it is with the Egyptian myths. So what can we do then? How can we form a hermeneutical model for framing the pagan myths to understand them from a biblical perspective? Well, I would say that we can take a few bits of information straight from the Bible that would help us to explain them. First of all, we'll assume that the Bible is the correct record, and we have plenty of reasons to make that assumption. And I think that we can do as Paul Garner was speaking earlier in this webinar about forming interdisciplinary models to understand our history, Earth history and science. And I think using some interdisciplinary models, we can help understand how human dispersion took place. And the Tower of Babel event could help us explain the origins of the similarities in the pagan myths, not just in the Egyptian account, but even far away in the Popol Vuh. So let's take a look at some of the models that have been developed. Here is a map proposed. It's available on the Answers in Genesis website about the ice age that likely occurred after the flood, according to some models. So after the flood, we would have had more ice on Earth. And since there's more ice, the water would have been sucked up into those, thus decreasing the levels of water relative to what we have today. Hence a lot of the hype that with the concern with global warming. If we have global warming and that melts the ice, what's going to happen? The beaches are going to rise up and sink a bunch of cities. Well, the other way is also true. The more ice we have, the lower the land goes, which could create several ice bridges as well as land bridges across the world that we don't necessarily have today. So we go forward and we get to the Tower of Babel here in the Middle East. Well, after this event, there is a great dispersion, and people are able to get across different areas because they have land bridges, and because people are smart and able to build boats. Well, whenever this happens, whenever the nations get dispersed, the nations are going to take with them a national memory of the time before the Tower of Babel. Everybody that was on the flood, the ark, all 8 of them, would have continued to talk about the pre-flood world. After the flood, they would have been able to express the creation account accurately. Several contemporaries of Adam would have died in the flood, so Noah would have had access to very reliable information there. Well, a clear understanding of creation and the flood and God would have been preserved through the flood. But then there was this case of rebellion at the Tower of Babel, after which the nations disperse. Well, as the nations disperse, they're going to have a national memory of the truth as it was declared by Noah. However, in the rebellious state of mind, they would have corrupted the truth as they went along. Hence the significant differences between the true biblical account and the false pagan accounts. However, it should come as no surprise, if the Bible is true, that there would be several pagan myths that are corrupted from the true account and therefore have small resemblances of similarity with the biblical account in the form of creation through expansion, creation through speech, global deluge, and all of that. Indeed, here is a map from the journal Anthropos in 1985, where uh, Bernhard Lang collected a map of several deluge myths around the world, some of them even including a rainbow motif all over the world, right? Well, how is this explained? Some would say it's just a local flood that we read about in Genesis. Well, I think that the pagan evidence would say that a lot of people around the whole entire world had the same experience, which makes sense if the Bible is correct that this was a global event followed by a dispersion. Okay. So I think that if we take all of the evidence into consideration and use the Bible as our interpretive lens to understand the world around us, we can read the pagan text through the lens of the Bible rather than the Bible through the lens of the pagan text. Let's take it one step further. Currently, the big creation myth that we are seeing is this notion of atheistic evolution. I think if we really take a look at what the ideology of atheistic evolution is all about, we will see that this is just a revamped paganism for today. It's not the Bible that borrows from the pagans, it's the atheists. So we have two competing worldviews, right? The biblical account presents one. It talks about the creator-creation distinction. God creates everything ex nihilo. There's nothing about me that is God's stuff. Adam was made out of dust that was created as a distinct thing from God, as opposed to what we see with the sneezing of Shu and Tefnut, right? Where everything is created a little bit out of God. We see a human exceptionalism, that Adam is made as a distinct creature that is different from the rest of creation and over creation. And this idea of an infinitely holy God and a unique creation of man, which has fallen, really serves as the foundation of the gospel, which is being tread underfoot by the pagan notion of the heart weighing ceremony, for example. Okay, that's the biblical worldview of creator-creation distinction. What are we seeing in the other worldview? It's one of continuity of being, that there is a pre-existent matter that becomes the universe. Therefore, I am made out of God's stuff, hence the deification of the body parts that we saw in the coffin. Humans are just part of nature, right? After all, I'm made out of God's stuff, so is that tree out there. So we are both one and the same, if you will, in an ontological sense. And it serves as the foundation for self-righteousness that we've seen very clearly in the pagan text. Okay, so which one is it then that the atheistic worldview is aligned with? Are they teaching a creator-creation distinction? Absolutely not. It's a continuity of being worldview that aligns with the pagan worldview. So I'll take one short little text of this. We could go through all sorts of material, but one would be this poem, We Are Star Stuff, cosmic poetry. You can look it up on YouTube here. In which Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's one of my favorite atheist speakers, he really is well-spoken. He says, we are made of star stuff. Notice the continuity of being. We are all connected to each other biologically, to the earth chemically, and to the rest of the universe atomically. Again, continuity of being. I am the universe. What's the end result? I actually feel quite large at the end of that. Elevating man, making him proud. It's not that we're better than the universe. We're parts of the universe. We're in the universe, and the universe is in us. We're not the center of the universe, but we are in it and of it. Notice how this has undertones that are much closer to New Age and paganism than to Christianity. That's simply because we could reframe the atheist discussion just as we could with the Mayan Popol Vuh, or the Egyptian pagan myths, as being all one and the same creation myth. Okay. Let's see here. All right. So in conclusion, the Bible has the correct account of our origins, of creation. It is not that the Bible is copying from the pagan myths, but rather that the pagan myths are most likely deriving corruption from the original Tower of Babel event, which the Bible speaks of. And so do the atheistic evolutionists. Okay, thank you so much for tuning in. Again, I am Paul Miles with the International Society for Biblical Hermeneutics.